Hi, I'm Jack Sullivan, and welcome to Dr. Scary Tales. Tonight, I've got a story that'll make your skin crawl, one that I've heard many times but can never forget. It's the kind of story that sticks with you long after the lights go out. So, if you're listening alone or in the dark, make sure you've got your headphones on, because every sound and whisper matters in this one. If you love eerie, spine-tingling stories like this one, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with the latest from Dr. Scary Tales. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, this story takes place in a small, quiet town in the Midwest. One of those places you'd pass by without a second thought. Cornfields, a diner, and one big Walmart Supercenter at the edge of town. I first heard about this story from an old colleague of mine, someone I worked with back when I was still moving around a lot for work. He was from that town, and let's just say he warned me to never go near that Walmart at night. At first I laughed it off, but after hearing the whole story, well, you'll see why I was so serious. It all starts with a guy named Ethan. He was the manager of the Walmart. Early 30s, single, a little lost in life if you ask me. Ethan had recently moved back to his hometown after trying to make it big in the city. He hated his job, hated how corporate treated him, but he needed the paycheck. Black Friday was coming up, and he knew the madness that night would bring. There was Jessica, one of the cashiers. A young woman, barely 21, working to put herself through college. Smart, sharp, but also kind of nervous. It was her first Black Friday at this store, and she had heard the stories. She wasn't sure if she believed them, though, until that night. And then there was Brad, the assistant manager. He was the kind of guy everyone hated, but no one would ever challenge. Slimy, manipulative, and always playing mind games. He'd worked at that Walmart for years, knew everything that went on behind the scenes. But there was one thing no one ever talked about with him. A woman named Annie, a former employee who had disappeared 5 years ago. Rumor had it she'd been involved with Brad, and she wasn't the first to go missing at that store. It was the night of Black Friday, just as the clock struck midnight. The storm outside had already knocked out power in most parts of town, but the store's backup generators kept the lights on, flickering but on. People flooded in, hunting for deals, their desperation almost tangible. The store was chaos. But amidst all that noise, something darker lingered. Jessica started noticing strange things first. Carts moving by themselves, the intercom crackling with static, voices whispering her name. But no one else seemed to notice. She shrugged it off, chalking it up to stress, until she saw the woman. A flash, a glimpse in the security monitor, long dark hair dressed in an old Walmart uniform, standing motionless in aisle 9. Jessica blinked, and the woman was gone. Ethan knew something wasn't right the moment he walked into that store, but he couldn't place it, not right away. Maybe it was the oppressive air, thick with humidity from the storm. Maybe it was the uneasy way the lights flickered just a little too often. Or maybe it was the feeling of being watched. That sensation that creeps up your spine when you're not sure if you're alone. But Ethan brushed it off. He had work to do. The store was chaos. Hundreds of people crammed into the aisles, tearing through shelves, grabbing at anything with a discount sticker. Black Friday at its worst. He kept his head down, trying to manage the crowd, but with every minute, the strange feeling grew stronger. Every time Ethan glanced at the security cameras, he'd see a flash of something in the corners of the screen. A shadow, just out of focus. A shape moving between the aisles, gone before he could make sense of it. And then, it wasn't just the cameras. The first time Ethan saw her, he thought it was just his imagination. Annie. standing at the end of aisle 9 staring at him. Her hair was long and dark, her face pale, too pale. She was dressed in the old Walmart uniform, the one she wore the night she disappeared. Ethan blinked, and she was gone. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the stress of the night, but deep down, he knew. Annie had always been there, lingering in the back of his mind, haunting him in more ways than one, and now it seemed she was back. At the same time, Jessica's shift was unravelling. She wasn't imagining things either. The intercom crackled to life when no one was near it, filling the store with static. She'd hear her name whispered in the white noise, sending chills down her spine. Carts moved on their own as though something was guiding them, blocking her path, turning sharp corners by themselves. And it wasn't just her imagination playing tricks. Customers began disappearing. At first she thought they were just wandering off, maybe to a different section of the store, or maybe they had found a better deal somewhere else. But then she found a cart, abandoned in the middle of aisle 3, half filled with items, its wheels still slowly spinning, as if someone had just been there. And then they were gone. Jessica's heart raced, but she didn't say anything. Who would believe her? She'd only been working there a few months, but every instinct in her body was telling her something was terribly wrong. Old Man Harris, the town local who everyone thought was just an eccentric old customer, had been watching her. He saw the way her eyes darted around looking for the shadows, just as his had so many years ago. He hobbled over to her with his slow, deliberate steps, leaned in and whispered, "Don't stray too far into the dark corners, girl. Not tonight." Jessica stared at him, confused, but before she could ask what he meant, he was already walking away. The store felt colder after that, the temperature dropping by the minute, even though the storm was raging outside. Her heart pounded as she walked back to the registers, her head spinning. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was terrified. While Ethan and Jessica wrestled with their growing fear of the supernatural, something far more dangerous was taking shape in the shadows. The Price Cutter, a name that had become an urban legend around the town, a masked figure who would use the chaos of Black Friday to strike. Some said he was a disgruntled former employee. Others claimed he was a local man who had lost his family to the holiday madness years ago, but no one knew for sure who or what he was. All they knew was that wherever he appeared, people didn't come back. Rick, the security guard, had heard the stories too, but he'd never believed them, not until that night. He was holed up in the security office watching the cameras, making sure no one was shoplifting. At first it was the usual Black Friday madness, people pushing, grabbing, fighting over deals. But then something caught his eye. One of the cameras, the one near the back of the store, showed a man wearing a dark hood and a mask, moving through the aisles. He wasn't shopping, he was stalking. Rick leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to get a better look. The man moved with purpose, but he didn't grab anything from the shelves. Instead, he followed customers, one by one, until they disappeared from view. Every time the masked man turned a corner, the person in front of him vanished. Rick's hands started to shake as he watched the screen, flipping through the camera feeds. There, the masked man was in aisle 5 now, following a mother with 2 children. Rick's heart pounded as he watched the man reach into his pocket and pull out something long and sharp, a box cutter, the Price Cutter. Before Rick could react, the feed cut out, plunging the office into static. He tried to switch to another camera, but the power was flickering, and the storm outside was knocking out signal after signal. "Not tonight," Rick muttered to himself, pulling out his flashlight and heading into the aisles. He had to stop him. But deep down, Rick knew this wasn't just a simple killer. Something else was happening in that store, and it was bigger than anyone had imagined. As Rick hunted down the price cutter, Ethan and Jessica were facing their own demons. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Annie was there, somewhere, watching him. The lights flickered above him, casting long, stretching shadows across the aisles. Every time he turned a corner, he saw glimpses of her, the ghost of the woman he had failed to protect. She was getting closer. He could feel it, and each time she appeared, the air grew colder until Ethan could see his breath fogging up in front of him. Jessica wasn't faring much better. She was trying to keep the customers calm, but it was clear that something was wrong. People were growing frantic, pushing and shoving in their desperation to leave the store. The power kept flickering, and with each blackout, more people disappeared. The price cutter was somewhere in the building, and Jessica knew that every second counted. But something else was stalking her too. The shadow of Annie loomed behind her, whispering her name. It was Old Man Harris who brought them together. He found Ethan first, pulling him into one of the back rooms. "I've seen it before," he said, his voice low and rough. "This store, it's cursed. Annie's death was just the beginning. There are others, people who died here, people who never left." Ethan's face went pale. "You mean Annie's ghost is real?" "As real as that storm outside," Harris replied. "And she's not the only one. The store is filled with their spirits, angry, hungry, waiting for justice." At that moment, Jessica stumbled in, her face pale and her hands shaking. "He's here," she whispered. "The price cutter, he's here, and he's hunting us." Rick burst in behind her, out of breath and sweating. "We have to get out of here. He's already killed 2 people, maybe more." But Old Man Harris shook his head. "You can't leave, not until it's finished." "What's finished?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking. "The curse," Harris said, his eyes narrowing. "You have to make it right. Annie's death, it was no accident. You know that, don't you?" Ethan's heart sank. He had known, he had always known. Annie's death had been covered up by Brad. The assistant manager had taken advantage of her, manipulated her, and when she threatened to expose him, he made her disappear. And Ethan? Ethan had looked the other way. Now the spirits of the dead employees weren't just haunting the store, they were demanding revenge. The storm outside raged harder, lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating the terrified faces of Ethan, Jessica, Rick, and Old Man Harris. They had no choice. They had to face both the human and the supernatural terror head on. Ethan led the way back into the main part of the store, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He could feel Annie's presence growing stronger with each step. He wasn't just running from her anymore, he was ready to face her. "Brad," Ethan whispered, his voice cracking, "it's time to pay for what you did." And there he was. Brad standing in the middle of the store, a smug grin on his face. He had known all along what was happening, but he hadn't cared. He thought he could control it, thought he could get away with murder. But as Annie's ghost appeared behind him, her cold, dead eyes locking onto him, Brad's grin faltered. The air around him grew cold, and his breath fogged up in front of him. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, you can't. You can't do this." But it was too late. Annie's ghost reached out, her hand gripping his shoulder with a strength that no living person could possess. Brad screamed, but his voice was lost in the howling wind. The shadows swallowed him whole, dragging him into the darkness. Meanwhile, Rick was facing off with the price cutter. The masked man stalked through the aisles, his box cutter glinting in the flickering light. But Rick wasn't about to back down. He had spent years dealing with petty criminals, but this was personal. He charged at the price cutter, tackling him to the ground. The two men struggled, their bodies crashing into shelves, scattering merchandise everywhere. Jessica stood frozen in place, her eyes darting between the two battles unfolding before her. Annie's ghost was dragging Brad into the void, while Rick fought for his life against the price cutter. Old Man Harris watched from the shadows. His eyes narrowed, knowing that whatever happened next would decide the fate of everyone in the store. With one final burst of strength, Rick overpowered the price cutter, slamming his head into the ground. The mask fell off, revealing the face of a broken, tormented man. Annie's brother. The brother who had sworn to avenge her death, no matter what it took. "I did it for her," he gasped, blood dripping from his mouth. "I did it for Annie." Ethan watched as Annie's ghost released Brad, her job done. She turned to Ethan, her eyes softening for the first time. "You should have protected me," she whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "But now you've made it right." And with that, she disappeared, her spirit finally at peace. The storm outside began to calm, the winds dying down, the thunder fading into the distance. The lights in the store flickered back to life, and the oppressive darkness that had filled the aisles slowly lifted. Ethan, Jessica, and Rick stood in the middle of the store, breathing heavily, their bodies shaking from the ordeal. Old Man Harris stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "It's over," he said, "but the store will never forget." And with that, they left, the shadows of Walmart still clinging to their memories, knowing that the horrors they had faced would stay with them forever. And that's the story of the midnight hunt at Walmart. A night filled with greed, guilt, and something far more terrifying lurking in the aisles. Sometimes a store isn't just a place to shop. Sometimes it holds secrets that are better left forgotten. If this story sent a shiver down your spine, make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There are plenty more unsettling tales waiting for you here at Dr. Scary Tales. And trust me, the next one might be even scarier.